Let's take a look at Canon's new EOS 90D. To be honest, it's a magnificent camera. It's 32 megapixels, APS-C. If a full-frame camera had this much linear resolution, it would need over 80 megapixels. This is extraordinary. Even more extraordinary is that it runs at 10 frames per second. Canon should need no introductions. Admittedly, here on YouTube, where every 3-year-old has a YouTube channel and reviews cameras, it's a little different. Canon's EOS system has been around for over 30 years. It came out in 1987. I've been shooting Canon since the 1970s. I've been shooting period for over 50 years. The beautiful thing about this camera is it's not some new camera that just got invented like Sony or Fuji systems that really are still trying to figure out what they're doing. Although hats off to Sony, who's done a remarkable job in just the past 5 or 8 years of really having a full-fledged system. But Canon has been the #1 selling camera brand for about 20 years now. In the professional world, they overtook Nikon back in the 1990s and have never given it up. I mean, don't look at me. Just look at any major sporting events like Super Bowl. Look at all the cameras. They're all 1DX Mark, well, whatever the current version is. There may be some Sonys and some Nikons there, but for the most part, it's Canon. Why? Superior cameras, superior support. You have any questions, United States, just call 1-800-OK-CANON. Whoever picks up the phone always knows the answer to my question right off the top of their head. I don't get somebody who's reading off a script in some foreign country. Canon actually cares about us. So for anybody who's been shooting Canon for a while, the beautiful thing about the 90D is that everything just works exactly like we expect it's going to work. It's a magnificent camera. It is the world's state-of-the-art camera for APS-C. It is a consumer-oriented camera. It differs from the 7D Mark II in several ways. For instance, something as simple as having only one card instead of two. But I'll get into that a little bit later. The key is if you're thinking you want this camera, you're going to love this camera. It is so far ahead of any mirrorless camera in terms of, well, other than Sony's A9 and some of their very top cameras, but in terms of speed and autofocus, if you're shooting action, don't even think about a mirrorless camera unless you want to go off to something like Sony. But here's the thing. Sony has an atrocious, meaning really bad menu system. The color quality is not as good as Canon, at least for nature and landscape, where I like to set things up to infinity for saturation and shoot in JPEG, which of course is an artistic decision. But I love Canon. I can't tell you how much I love Canon. If you're thinking of this camera, don't even watch the rest of this video. Just go get it. Unlike other brands, there are no rough edges on a Canon. Not just in terms of how it really feels. Notice how there's no straight lines in any of this. This camera feels wonderful. Everything's at the right angle. All these controls are very carefully designed, and so they just feel great. It's not like the lesser brands that are still trying to figure out how to do things and how to make the buttons work and are still trying to get their act together. This camera just goes, which is why, again, Canon is the #1 choice of professionals worldwide and has been for, I think, about 20 or 30 years. This is a magnificent camera for sports, nature, landscape, portraits, corporate events, anything you might want to shoot. There's nothing this camera can't do. For birding, it's extraordinary because of its linear resolution. That means for birds where you have to crop in, there's no camera that's going to give you a better result when you start cropping in to get your birds. With your 600 millimeter lens, you can crop and crop and crop and have more pixels left over per millimeter. And with 10 frames per second and this extraordinary autofocus system, you are good to go. So birders, I would say, rejoice. Let's cover what's new from 2016's 80D, which is admittedly, they're both great cameras. The 80D sells for less, but let's cover what's new. Specifically, we've got 32 megapixels instead of 24. Whether you care or not, I don't know, but that's a major feature. What is really important is it goes 10 frames per second as opposed to just 7 in the 80D. If you're shooting any kind of sports or action, that makes a difference sometimes between getting your shot and just getting an oops with someone's eyes closed. The top regular ISO now goes to 25,000. It was only 16,000 in the 80D. The top pushed ISO goes to 51,200. It was 25,600 in the 80D. The battery life is way up, rated 1,860 shots versus 1,390 in the old 80D. It's got a new 220,000 pixel RGB plus infrared meter sensor. The rear control wheel lock lever is angled up, so it's unlikely to get knocked by accident when it's carried around the neck. This is lock, that's unlock. The 80D had this straight, so you sometimes could accidentally lock this by accident. New is a spot AF mode where you can get even tinier AF sensors. This is the first Canon DSLR compatible with UHS 2 SD cards. It does up to 4K at 2997. The 80D stopped at 1080 at 5994. The HDMI output works up to 4K. The way this thing processes so many pixels per second is it has a Digic 8 as opposed to a Digic 6 processor in the 80D. These top buttons here, these guys here, they poke up a little bit more from the surface than they did in the 80D. When I'm shooting, I don't stop and look at these buttons. I touch these by feel. You notice it has a little indentation on this, so you can tell which one's the ISO button and just feel left and right. When I'm shooting, I don't want to take my eye from the finder, and this lets me do that. Again, this is an absolutely brilliant camera because of all these little things. Also changed is the play button. Now moves down onto this dial. It used to be someplace else. The flash button moves around a little bit compared to 80D. I don't think it matters. Again, you can always look at my written review at kenrockwell.com, where I have the knock down, drag out, everything you could ever want to know details on, everything. When you shoot RAW plus JPEG and you hit delete, you can delete just one of the two files instead of both if you like. What's beautiful is, and I can't really show you here, but the level display icon in the Finder is the most brilliant viewfinder level display I have ever seen. It's a little gray icon which overlays on top of your clear part of your image, and it shows you just enough so that you can see if your camera's level or tilted, and it doesn't get in the way of composing your picture. It's brilliant. The first camera ever to do this. Usually the displays are something that's not really legible while you're trying to shoot, or in the case of mirrorless cameras, it's just like in your face, on your face, and you can't see past the indicator for level. Brilliant. It's 1.2 ounces, or 34 grams lighter than the 80D. There's no flash or CA settings on this top dial. That's okay. I only use C1, C2, and then PTV, AV, and M when setting my first settings. There's no longer NFC. It's just got Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. And admittedly, you know, everybody gets excited about this. I don't use Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or apps. If I want to process something in an app and email it to somebody, I just shoot it on my iPhone. This camera is for serious shooting. It's got 10 frames per second, but it's not just 10 useless frames per second like most mirrorless cameras advertise. The point is this will shoot 10 frames per second, tracking dynamic autofocus and tracking exposure from frame to frame. Most of the mirrorless cameras simply lock the focus and lock the exposure, so who cares? Of course, the image quality is unbeaten. Nikon and Canon are the world's best. When I shoot my nature landscape shots, if I shoot it on Canon and Nikon, I get the best results. The other kinds of cameras just haven't gotten the colors down as well as Canon and Nikon have after all these years. It's personal preference, and I always shoot setting into vivid or plus large amounts of saturation, and I shoot directly in JPEG. I don't need to shoot RAW because I get the results I want straight out of the camera. We all have our preferences, but I prefer Nikon and Canon for that. The battery life is almost limitless, rated 1,860 shots. For those of you who may be considering mirrorless, mirrorless has crummy. Has maybe 1/4 or 1/2 of that, which means with mirrorless, you're always watching your battery power. With a digital single lens reflex, you can shoot for a week. In fact, the biggest problem is you may get this camera, shoot it for a week, then go off on vacation and completely forget to bring your charger or to charge the battery before you leave. And then oops, then get stuck while you're out there because you just get used to it running forever. It's not like when you have to charge your phone every day. Flash sync speed is a grown-up 1/250th, the way it should be. It's not a little lackluster 1/180th or 200th like too many of the lesser cameras do today. It also shoots square and 4:3 ideal format, as well as 16:9 as shot crops. It only shows little black lines in the Finder. It doesn't gray out the edges of the Finder, which I prefer, although maybe it does that and just haven't discovered it. But by all means, if you want to shoot square or 4:3 as shot, it does that. I love this camera. It's got focus bracketing or focus stacking, which just like the EOS RP, means you put this thing on a tripod, let it make a series of shots at different focusing distances, then pull all those images into software, and it's amazing that it can give you something that's sharp from near to far, and especially for macro shots, it's something that can't be done any other way. You have your choice when shooting 4K video. You can either shoot direct pixel by pixel, so it doesn't do any interpolation, or you can shoot full frame. It has both microphone and headphone jacks. It does HDR multiple exposures, and here's the other thing. Canon is a quality product. It is made domestically in Japan. It is made for the highest quality. It is not offshore to China or Indonesia or someplace, some nasty third world or communist country. It's made in the real world. It's made in Japan, first world country, by people that actually care about quality. And even better, it's got 100% United States-based, native English-speaking Americans on the phone when you call 1-800-OK-CANON. You don't get somebody in some foreign country. You ever see that little meme showing some guy in India sitting in a trash dump working on some laptop powered by a goat turning a bicycle wheel? And that's what you get when you call most companies for customer support? No. Canon has real people, real Americans helping you out who actually know photography and actually can get you the answer to whatever you want. The only thing bad about this camera is that it has a curse typical to many of the Canon cameras. This little light here is for the self-timer. It doesn't have a built-in autofocus illuminator, so it uses its flash and fires multiple bursts of flash, either this flash or if you have an outboard flash without the infrared illuminator, which annoys the heck out of people, so I turn that off. Honestly, the autofocus works so great, I don't need the illuminator, but if you do, know that it doesn't have the annoying LED, it has the annoying pop-up flash. It's also only got one card slot. I personally prefer two, not so much because cards have errors today, but because I have errors, and I'll sometimes get a little bit trigger happy with my delete button and delete something. When I have two cards, I still have an extra on the other card. It has no USB, inductive, or wireless charging. The battery only charges externally in its charger, like a real camera. But there is no USB charging. There's no automatic brightness control for the rear LCD, which very few cameras have. There's no ability to save or recall the camera settings to a card. The manually timed exposure times only go out to 30 seconds, which is typical for most electronic cameras, but today the cameras sometimes go out to a couple of minutes. I'm going to complain about that. You see, it'll go down to 30 seconds, like every camera does, but that's it. There's no option to let it go out to a few minutes or an hour and a half. Some cameras have done that, like the Nikon F, that's F as in film 5, has done that ever since the 1990s. And some of Fuji cameras today now can go to longer shutter speeds. That's something I'd like to see, but it doesn't do that. The buttons are not illuminated like every phone has done for the past 10, 20, 30 years. It doesn't have every possible rate and speed and time of video for rates and resolutions. You can check kenrockwell.com. Check the link in my description where I have a knockdown, drag out, exhaustive list of it. It doesn't do the straight 24, 30, 60, or 120 video options. It does only the pull down 23.976, 29.97, 59.94, and 119.88 rates, and it calls them so, which may confuse innocent people, but the point is it's unusual. You'd want to shoot at the even rates of 24.00, 30.00, 60.00, or 120.00, but if you have to ask, know that this camera does what you want it to do. There's no GPS. You can use the Canon GPS receiver GPE2. There's no NFC, just Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. I never found out how to do custom file names. In other words, the files always come out img.whatever. I can't name them 90D or Ken 123 like I'd like to do. There's no camera image stabilization, but no other DSLR does this either, so don't worry about it. And guess what? Canon's in-lens image stabilization works better than any in-camera sensor shift stabilization system I've ever used. It works with every Canon EF and EFS lens. It won't work with the RF lenses for the new mirrorless cameras because there's too much distance between this lens mount and down there in that sensor. The mirrorless cameras have the lens flange much closer to the sensor, which lets them have more freedom to design sharper lenses, but this camera doesn't do that, and the reason why is, you see that mirror? That's the R. That's the reflex mirror, which is the R in DSLR. In case you're wondering, this is the lovely Canon EF 50mm f1.2 LUSM. Fantastic lens. I just happen to have that one on my camera here today because it's smaller than a zoom. I want to show you this. Autofocus, if we get into performance. Autofocus is fast and sure. There's no problems. Canon's been doing this for a very long time. The autofocusing system is brilliant. They can track things around. Just set it as I show in my user's guide, kenrockwell.com. Look for the 90D, which is also in the description of this video. And I have a reasonably okay user guide telling you some of the basics of how to get this thing set up and go. But you can set it up so it'll identify your target and just track it all around, up, down, left, and right, in and out. It's so much better than anything mirrorless short of Sony. Manual focus is also great. You just turn this ring. It's a real ring. It's not some electronic garbage that goes through a encoder. And just look for the dot in the lower right of the finder. In fact, here's a picture through the finder. Lower right-hand dot next to the 29 means you're in focus. Boom, you're done. Auto ISO is great. You can set it to anything. The shutter goes up to an 8,000th of a second, by the way. Auto white balance worked great. The finder is bright and sharp, as I just showed. Although that picture, which is actually a picture I took through the finder is much sharper than that picture is. It's very difficult to photograph through a finder. The pop-up flash does great for fill flash. I wish all my cameras had a pop-up flash. The one gotcha is, like a lot of pop-up flashes, it will take a couple of seconds to recharge if it had to fire at full power. You will see the letters BUSY, busy, in the bottom of your finder while it recycles, and it won't let you take another picture for those couple of seconds till the flash recycles. Although if you're in a real busy and need to get off fast, just pop the flash down and turn it off. It's not smart to shoot around that. High ISOs look great, as we expect. I mean, it's not 2003 anymore. The beauty of it is, as these ISO goes up, these are full images. The color doesn't change. This is set with +4 color saturation, which is the way I like to shoot. And as I'm going up here in ISO, you'll notice the colors don't change. It doesn't even get that bad. When we get to the very highest ISOs, it gets a little rattier, but not a lot. The biggest, and that's the important thing, for most pictures you're going to shoot at whatever ISO you need. It's better to shoot at a high ISO than a long shutter speed if you're going to get a blurry picture. If I zoom way, 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 way in, this is that same image before, and now it's magnified about 10 times. You'll notice at ISO 100, everything's sharp. And every time we go up in ISO a little bit, it gets a little softer and smaller details start to evaporate. That's because the noise reduction software inside the camera is doing its best to get rid of the noise, but it also gets rid of some of the details in the process. So the picture doesn't get noisier so much as it just loses details. In other words, it looks like someone's taken an eraser to my image and starting to erase it when we're looking here at high ISOs. And you'll notice it looks like the picture's almost completely erased. Why? The noise reduction software is getting rid of all that grain, and there's very little picture left after it scrubs out all the grain. So the real question about ISO, and people say, oh, how high an ISO can I use, really depends on how far you want to enlarge it. For lens corrections, you can correct for fall off, you can correct for distortion, then everything else is bundled under Digital Lens Optimizer. Some quick comparisons to the 80D. I covered that extensively at the beginning. This is in every way a better camera, except for I think unless you need NFC, it just costs more and it's newer. We know that. The real question you've got is, what about the 7D Mark II, which has the same frame rate and it's older? Well, here's the deal. The 7D Mark II is a more professionally oriented camera. It has 2 card slots, not just one. It has a Prontor Compure, otherwise known as PC Flash Sync terminal for Studio Flash, which I never use in my studio. It has more advanced menu options and more AF areas, but it has the same frame rate and a lower resolution than this camera does. I don't see that there's any difference in performance of the autofocus system between the 7D Mark II and this camera. This camera is newer. It has fewer autofocus zones. So what? It's got a bunch of zones. The other one has a bunch of zones. It doesn't really matter. I would go with, and although I have not made a direct comparison, I suspect this one probably has a better autofocus system because it's newer, has a much higher capacity computer in it, and therefore can process everything much more quickly. You know, it's funny. If you just look at one autofocus sensor and just focus in and out, and just let the autofocus move it in and out, ever since the 1980s, if I get up my 1987 EOS 620, it focuses about as quickly in and out. The difference in autofocus systems is how well they track left and right, up and down, and figure out what's going on, and hand off between autofocus areas and work with all those areas at once and get you sharp shots a lot. That's where these cameras with their higher processing ability really get better. The 7D Mark II is 29% heavier than this 90D. The 7D Mark II has a larger top LCD. This little display here is bigger. Honestly, I don't use these anymore. These are throwback to film, but it's bigger and more legible than the 7D Mark II. Something I do miss that the 7D Mark II and my 5 DSR and the other Pro Canons can do is the ability to set this set button so that when I hit set, that it just calls up playback and zooms in. So when I shoot a picture, instead of having it come up automatically and having to zoom in, I will just not have it come up automatically. But when I hit set, it will come up and be zoomed in right to the appropriate point. This camera can't do that. That's the only thing besides the second card slot that I really miss on this camera compared to some others. The 7D Mark II can do that. All 3 cameras have the same LCD screen. They're all 3-inch 1.04 megadot screens. They all flip except the 7D Mark II does not flip. They all take the same battery, the LPE6N. The battery life, as I said, is better on this camera than the 80D. It's pretty crummy on the 7D Mark II, rated only 800 shots. But guess what? The shutter life, in terms of how many shots you can make before the shutter simply falls apart, is rated about 200,000 shots on the 7D Mark II. I don't know how many this can go for. And honestly, people worry about that. Don't worry. Canon has an excellent service facility. Every time I've sent stuff in, it gets fixed and it doesn't get broken or damaged or otherwise screwed up. If you ever wear out a shutter, which I doubt you ever will, even on a basic Canon camera, set it in for service, probably for a couple of $100, boom, you'll get a brand new shutter and you'll be ready for another, 300,000 shots, whatever it has. All 3 of these cameras have a built-in flash. Only the 7D Mark II has a Prontor Compure Flash Sync terminal. Only this 90D can shoot 4K for video. And all 3 are quality made in Japan. Thank goodness. And that's it. Anybody who shoots Canon, I love this camera. It's a no-brainer. If you want one, you want one. If you don't shoot Canon, you should. I review a lot of cameras. Most people know me for Nikon, but I updated to Canon when the 5D Mark III came out. It was so much better than, I think, the D810 or D8, whatever it was at the time. You can get what you want. By all means, get Canon, because it's not just the camera. The reason they're number one with the pros is the support. The warranty service, the technical support if you get stuck, the overall design of the camera, the way it handles, the way it feels in your hand, the way the pictures look. Nikon is just as good when it comes to the way it feels and the way it shoots and the way the pictures look, but Nikon falls behind because they don't have the customer care that Canon has. And Nikon doesn't quality make their products in Japan. They make only the most expensive products that nobody actually buys in Japan. Everything else gets offshore to China. With Canon, your goods are made in Japan the way they should be. And that's a quick look at Canon's newest 90D. Again, I'm Ken Rockwell. By all means, look at the full written review at kenrockwell.com. And I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of what I have learned about the Canon 90D. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell, kenrockwell.com, and kenrockwell.tv.